on the recently published book, The Muslim Secular. The author of the book, Dr Amar Sohal, has kindly agreed to share some thoughts with us on what's the significance of the book, and we are also looking forward to engage with some of the propositions he's making. And this is a hotly debated title, if you like, because yesterday only we were at Jamia, and the discussion was oscillating between the Muslim secular, Muslim and Muslim secular, or whatever, nationalist Muslim, Muslim nationalist. I think today we have got another opportunity to engage with this idea. So I'm speaking with that. My name is Javed Iqbal Wani, and I am currently the head of research and publications at the CSPS, the host of this talk. And just to give you an idea, Amar and others who are doing this first time, the organization was set up 4 years ago. The primary goal of the organization is to train young scholars, young minds in terms of driving towards more criticized thinking. We invite scholars from across social sciences and humanities and create possibilities where those scholars can have very cozy small group discussions with our interns. We have a very robust research and energy program here. Some of the interns are already there in the audiences. We hope to take this format further and improve on this as we go ahead in time. Today we have amongst us Dr Amir Ali, who will be the chair of the session, and we have two very important scholars, Dr Laurence Gautier and Dr Irfanullah Farooqi, who will be commenting on Sohal's work. With these initial comments, I hand over the proceedings to the chair, Dr. Amar.
Thank you, Javed. This is the first time I've been in this very nice office, I must say. I was like delighted to enter a very nice, well-lit space. So, I'll just make 2 points with your permission. Of course. Actually, these 2 points arose as you were speaking, Javed, so I'm going to get it off my mind. Just kind of two prefatory remarks. The title, it's intriguing. I think quite often, I hate the title of my 2 books. They were enforced on me by the publisher. But I think the title is good because it's captured something, and I think all titles should catalyze. That's the thing about title, so that you're forced to read the book. Now, the Muslim secular reminds me of 2 things, which I must find important to. Firstly, the point you made, the discussions we were having yesterday, nationalist Muslim, national. So I was often asked this question some, I think, 10 years ago, 11 years ago. Are you a liberal Muslim? And it was a very irritating question. Everywhere I go, are you a liberal Muslim? Because people want to categorize and catalog and place no views on it. And I got really irritated one day with this question because the people are liberal prefixing anything in the liberal part of predominates over what comes next. Democracy, right? It hegemonizes democracy. So I answered like this: I'm a liberal and a Muslim, and a Muslim and a liberal in no particular lexical ordering. So, and then this second thing which kind of came to my mind as you were speaking about it is that the Muslim secular also reminds me of 1950s Muslim socialism. Very famous movies. Those wonderful romantic, mushy romance, but then the things. I know, you have the wonderful Dr Guru Dutt, and the way that the Muslim fallen aristocracy was portrayed. I think to talk about the secular in this time is an act of audacity. To not put too fine a point of it. And therefore, to talk about this, I think at this point is very significant, very important. Also, the characters that we put together, Azad, Sheikh Abdullah, is a pretty important and interesting way of this. They look like a melange. And there's a good pattern that is emerging, a pattern of parity. I think that's an important thing. But I don't want to say too much because, of course, I'm the star speaker. So, with that, 40 minutes, and then we'll have a question.
Well, thank you very much, first to the Centre for having me and inviting me to this talk. To Dr. Javed Wani for his introduction, and of course to Dr. Amar for some lovely remarks there. And when you were touching on, the idea of, the liberal Muslim, and made me think back to why I never called this book secular Muslims. because that would be as if to say, this is a conceptual category that I try to produce in this book. And we'll get to the meaning of what but hopefully by the end of these 40 minutes, what exactly is meant by so, yeah, I'm really looking forward to this discussion and to hear what Irfan and Laurence have to say about it too, and I hope we'll have a nice discussion all of us together as well afterwards. So without further ado, I'll crack on. I'm just going to kind of introduce you here to the big themes and big arguments that I'm trying to make in this book, without really furnishing them with too much detail. It's really going to be a theoretical and conceptual discussion, I think. And we can talk about how I flesh these things out in the chapters themselves with that detail if you're interested in. So, before the era of decolonization finally dawned, many anti-colonial and indeed imperial thinkers had already suggested separating out supposedly incompatible majorities and minorities into sovereign equals. So partitions, therefore, frequently emerged as the victorious solution for forestalling the tyranny of numbers, not just in Hindu majority India, but also in Palestine and earlier in Ireland. In fact, after the Second World War, the idea of devolving sovereignty to a minority was also being considered again in Europe. So the categories and resolutions of the decolonizing world were not exceptional to it. But this book represents, I think, an effort instead to read the Indian history of decolonization against the grain, to excavate from the subject position of minority a generalizable political theory for shared sovereignty and inclusive nationalism. I've tried to demonstrate that the minor or minority in fact allows us to think of the major or majority not just as an antagonistic entity that is set against it, but to which it can belong and in fact uniquely complete. More precisely, if the undertaking of unity always tasks the majority to first make an appeal to the minority, ultimately that's where its work ends. It is for the minority to decide whether or not to uphold any such appeal. Does the minority continue to be a minority willingly, or does it in fact want to turn itself into a majority? That is the question that confronts Muslim political thinking in the period of Ambedkar. So in other words, and however strange it might sound today, theoretically only the Muslim can finally actuate secular Indian democracy, even if the conditions for it have to be set by others. Whatever its origins may have been, secularism as a modern ideal has to do with the neutral nation-state's management of religious plurality and the preparedness of its diverse citizenry to find ways of living together amicably, rather than pleading to be secured within the secular, as has sometimes been suggested. My point is that Indian Muslim politics, which has otherwise been associated with Muhammad Ali Jinnah's victorious Pakistan movement, was not only capable of theorizing the secular, its minoritarian subject position meant that it was in fact best positioned to do so. And so, provided that they do not wish to become majorities themselves, secularism has been and remains for mostly the prerogative of religious minorities across the world. While Indian secularism as a tradition undoubtedly boasts of eminent and committed Hindu ideologues, I'm thinking of course of Jawaharlal Nehru and Muhammad Ali, this question was existential. The question of Indian secularism is existential, or was existential for their Muslim peers in quite different and more direct ways. Mine is thus not an identitarian argument, but a more generally structural one about the very workings of politics, which a comparison with the question of caste, I think, helps to confirm. So the anti-caste politics of affirmative action is made thinkable principally by the formerly untouchable minority itself, through its leaders like the lawyer politician B.R. Ambedkar. By concentrating on their traditional untouchable identity, Ambedkar hoped to secure their status as a political constituency and finally offset that customary discrimination. Similarly, secularism is very possible, politically possible, by Muslim endorsement. So I excavate this Muslim secular mostly from the archive of three eminent thinkers and leaders of the anti-colonial struggle, allies of Gandhi and Nehru, the two-term Indian National Congress president, Abul Kalam Azad, a Urdu writer and Islamic scholar, Maulana, as well as the preeminent anti-colonial actors of Kashmir and the Pashtun frontier, Sheikh Abdullah and Abdul Ghaffar Khan, who both arrived at Indian nationalism only after thorough theorizations of their respective Kashmiri and Pashtun political worlds. That is to say, that this Indian nationalism is conditional on the founding of Kashmiri and Pashtun autonomy, and we can get into that complicated story as the paper goes on, and of course in the discussion too. So in the time that I have remaining, I want to really outline four main themes or interventions. The first really the interplay between the universal and the secular in this thinking. So when the caliphate was abolished by Turkish nationalists in 1924, its anti-colonial and pan-Islamist Muslim supporters in India were forced to reconsider their understanding of the political community. A new era now beckoned. Any serious claim to political freedom had to adopt the almost unanimously endorsed language of national self-determination. Till now, by disregarding differences across imperial borders, pan-Islamism had allowed these leaders to uphold the essential universalism of their faith. It had made it easy to stress the unity not merely of the world's Muslims, but a wider human race created and sustained by a single God. Territorial nationalism, meanwhile, as it had been theorized and practiced in Europe, or modern Europe, provided its antithesis. Dividing the world into confrontational groups of friends and enemies, it was impossible for Azad and Muhammad Khan, wedded as they were to Islamic universalism, to accept unadulterated versions of the nation. And of course, Abdullah's career begins a little later in 1931. So, unlike their great contemporary and unbending critic of the national model, Muhammad Iqbal, champions of the Muslim secular chose instead to bring Islamic universalism to bear on the national idea itself in a counterintuitive effort to revise it. Writing in 1927, a year after Muhammad Khan had visited an array of nationalists in Muslim West Asia and North Africa, Azad claimed that the problem with nationalism was that its European thinkers and statesmen had elevated affiliations of race, color, language, and culture to hierarchical distinctions that had perpetuated their own violence in an unequal, colonized world. However, according to Azad, who came from a family of Delhi theologians, as you know, for Islam, all humans possessed an identical rank. Racial difference, the Maulana wrote, was premised on a misreading of our fundamental oneness, while other identitarian dissimilarities, however real they might be, were ultimately the result of historical and geographical circumstance. These were to be celebrated, of course, but not at the cost of dehumanizing the cultural other. So the task for figures like Azad and Muhammad Khan was to find a, quote, middle course between a large-hearted Islam and the given circumstances of post-war politics. This meant warding off the chauvinism and prejudices intrinsic to orthodox nationalism and which inevitably led to an avaricious imperialism, while nevertheless enabling its positive, domestic or internal aspects, that is, the democratic spirit of liberty and popular sovereignty, which promised to finally reverse the historic rule of the many by the few. In effect, Azad and Ghaffar Khan was smuggling their earlier non-national concepts into a revised idea of India as a nation-state. This meant not only a negotiated endorsement of the nation, but also, I think, a secret continuity with Khilafat politics. After all, Azad had argued at the height of that previous campaign that it was not the Caliph himself who mattered. Rather, of most importance was the fact that his personhood had long stood in for or upheld Muslim universalism. Now counterintuitively instantiated in the nation itself, such universalism was therefore quite transferable, so you could shift this universalism around to guarantee it. So managing India's plurality is important to the humanist ambitions of this Islamic universalism. Quite clear. So if it could find space for regional and religious diversity, India would be, to misquote their opponent Iqbal only very slightly, the greatest Muslim country in the world. The universal concept of insaniyat, or humanity, becomes the foundation from which one must launch an anti-partition argument. So you can see the beginnings of this logic emerging. This new national unity did not mean the dissolution of religious particularity into some kind of homogeneous whole. From the subject position of minority, that would almost certainly have meant neglecting, if not forfeiting, Islam in India. Homogenization was thus another violent element of European nationalist modernity to be strongly resisted or integrated. And so, when I talk in the book about the interactive nationalism, I mean I mean one which, outside the autonomous realm of religious practice, frequently traversed the boundary between Hindu and Muslim to produce something shared. What particularly interests me is the conceptual character of what is an inter, but also often an extra-religious interaction. Retaining the separate integrities of Hinduism and Islam, the Muslim secular nevertheless opens Indians to a nationality founded upon things as diverse as a common pre-colonial inheritance. That's something that particularly interests Azad. A collection of shared ethno-linguistic particularities dotted across the country, something that particularly interests Abdullah, and reciprocal ethical agreements in the face of colonial violence. I'm thinking especially of Abdullah. So, to be clear, the secular for these figures was a shared Indian public space consisting of both religious and non-religious elements. As such, I'm calling for a significant realigning not just of Indian Islam, but also of global Islam as a category. Today, when Islam has come to assume a crucial position as the religious or the theological in many secular Western societies, to which it is a relatively new addition, our international debate about its relationship with the non-religious state is saturated by what I think are the modest concerns of Islamism. If politics is determined by our ability to think and act freely in the temporal world, Islamism is anti-political, for it gives sovereignty up to God and is interested not in any human agency, but in maintaining the supremacy of theology in everyday life. Its critical engagement with secularism rests merely on the demand that the liberal state safeguard the freedom and integrity of Islam. I want to claim that there exists, beyond these narrow confines, a much deeper engagement with pluralism that prompts Islam to have far grander ambitions than simply its own preservation. It asks instead a much larger question. How do Muslims, without giving up their faith, unite with the other communities of their country to form a cohesive society as opposed to resigning themselves to cultural apartheid? And that's one of the reasons why the ulema, the so-called nationalist ulema, are really only interlocutors of things they look at rather than merged within this category. So Jinnah also pursued, of course, a secular politics of sorts, even after his decisive turn to Muslim nationalism from around 1937. The irreligious Jinnah was interested not in any theocratic project, though sections of the Pakistan movement were. Jinnah instead channeled the tide of global politics, namely the collapse of the League of Nations and its language and minority rights, to elevate the Muslim minority to the insurmountable rank of a sovereign national majority. And that, of course, is Faisal Dirji's work in Muslim Zion. But once secularism is provided with its thicker definition of state neutrality and cultures of coexistence, I think that category or that ism, secularism, becomes increasingly unsuitable for Jinnah and appropriate for his opponents. This is because you could scarcely theorize coexistence at any length when, at least prior to 1947, his efforts were directed at the opposite task of unpicking so-called Hindu India from Muslim India in order to render them sovereign. And Islam, however under-theorized the category it was for Jinnah, had to be made the binding agent of this so-called Muslim India. If the theological then led Azad to the secular, the reverse was true for Jinnah. Azad's Islamic universalism generated an interactive secular Indian nationalism, while Jinnah's temporal concerns about minorityhood produced a political theology of a different kind. To be sure, a majoritarian rather than a theocrat, Jinnah nevertheless premised his sovereign political community on the social reality of Islam. So Azad contests Jinnah's logic by claiming that Muslims, given their intrinsic communitarian strength as a social unit in India, were only ever a nominal minority there. The world's largest concentration of Muslims, with majorities in 5 of India's 12 provinces, their sheer size assured certain influence. Moreover, unlike India's Hindus, who were fragmented by quote, social and racial divisions, its 95 million Muslims were united by an egalitarian, quote, Islamic brotherhood. This amounted not only to an acknowledgement of the hierarchical caste divisions found within the Hindu majority, which, according to Azad, made its communal consolidation so very unlikely. It also represented a denial of such petrified caste discrimination and of any meaningful interdenominational conflict among Muslims too. To align these realities was certainly not unique to the Maulana, or for that matter, Abdullah or Zafar Khan, and of course Jinnah too. it represented a common way of thinking among almost all those eminent and indeed upper caste Muslim figures who found themselves at the apex of late colonial Indian politics. But it would be, I think, a mistake to reduce these denials of difference to a privileged positionality alone. Such ecumenism, however real or imagined, was crucial to retaining not just Islam's universalism, but also its weight as a socio-political bloc prior to any meaningful national, or indeed in the League's case, international settlement with Hinduism. So despite his connections to Calcutta and to Delhi, Azad chose to background the local to represent the nation. So consequently, Azad is forced to confront the question of Muslim minority in a very direct way, in a more direct way, certainly, than either Abdullah or Farooqi. For these two men, that Hindu domination by democratic means had little import in their overwhelming Muslim majority homelands in India's mountainous northwest was crucial to their ultimate refusal of minorityhood. And while important, there was more to this imagination, and I already want to stress this, there was more to this imagination than simply establishing some kind of federal constitution in a single state. And what I want to emphasize is that by anchoring Muslim cultural expression within regional Kashmiri and Pashtun identities, Abdullah and Ghaffar Khan were able to transcend religious division at the national level, effectively territorializing or localizing Islamic notions of the community and its moral consensus or ijma, and thus settling the vexing question of Muslim self-statement prior to any discussion about Indianness. This grander national space of India is largely clear of religious competition. Consequently, it is more easily made the site for an unshackled association with other Indians of various persuasions. And in fact, Islamic ideas, notably of the anti-colonial jihad, were then able to serve not an exclusive Muslim project, but rather an inclusive Indian one. And it was by refusing to fully secularize their Kashmiri and Pashtun sub-nations that they were somewhat counterintuitively able to champion a supra-secular nationalism for all of India. And that, of course, produces problems with, internal minorities, if you will. But that's a whole other issue. So rather than posing a threat to Indian nationalism, these Muslim-dominated sub-nationalisms can be deeply held and yet remain firmly within its ambit because they, at least originally, and that's a crucial phrase, at least originally, do not make claims to absolute sovereignty. So from 1947, and you all know this story, once this kind of federal theory, if you like, collided with more dominant centralizing ones in both independent India and Pakistan, Abdullah and Ghaffar Khan played important roles in reanimating what I think really is South Asia's historical struggle between region and center. I guess one way you can understand the history of the subcontinent. There are many ways of understanding it, but the kind of region-center struggle is one way of really defining a much longer history stretching back many periods. But those animosities that Abdullah and Ghaffar Khan reanimate in the post-colonial period, is very important to stress, do not mask the fact that these figures also thought about how best to preserve India's unity in this very scalar way, right, between local, regional, and national. So, Abdullah and Ghaffar Khan, in the abstract at least, somewhat differently to Azad, also found another place to establish religion beyond the national space. All three men agreed that Hinduism and Islam were such formidable social facts that they did not necessitate their own sovereign nationality. So, by the end of this talk, I really hope to have demonstrated how the book counterpoises the reception of Dr Nehru as India's leading secular nationalist, to really pluralize that story. But for now, I really want to also emphasize that my other major objective has been to offset Jinnah's reception as India's unrivaled Muslim politician. His triumphant Pakistan movement, by providing Islam with a nation state of its own, constituted one path taken by Muslim minoritarian anxieties about liberal democracy. But though it was a failure by comparison, the Muslim secular, by generating a non-religious shared nationality that nevertheless preserved multiple religious and indeed regional identities within it, represented another path, untaken perhaps, of overcoming those mid-20th century anxieties around liberal democracy. So, Demography was not all that led our three protagonists to reject punishment, and I've stressed the importance of demography so far. Just as important were the negative social costs that they perceived of two diametrically opposed religious nations confronting one another. In short, Jinnah's two-nation theory was superfluous, but it was scarcely harmless, according to them. By forcibly delinking Hindu from Muslim in every possible way, these three men suggested that its unavoidable violence was destined to turn India's imperfect social equilibrium, both resilient and unstable in equal measure, into something much worse, irreversible antagonism. Animated by a deep historical sense of historicity, the Muslim secular recognized not just the shift in historical time from imperial to popular rule, but that enmity as much as amity had long defined the volatile familial relationship between Hindus and Muslims. And some of you will maybe recognize already that mine here is an engagement with Shruti Kapil's idea of a violent fraternity. And some of you would already, I'm sure, go to that particular book. So, for the figures that I'm looking at, to allow amity to flourish in this imperfect scenario where both amity and enmity exist, ethical Indians had to find ways of allaying enmity as much as was possible. So, Jinnah, meanwhile, was an anti-historical thinker. Vasudevji has shown that Hindus and Muslims were so interlocked or intertwined in history that Jinnah duly deleted the past to finally disentangle them for a new social contract between equals. But according to his three opponents, engineering a permanent division, as Jinnah straightforwardly suggested, was as naive as it was unnecessary. That would mean fracturing this delicately poised, but nevertheless integral society, and fanning the flames of enmity, which, in Irfan Khan's words, would likely spread in a wild blaze to finally consume amity altogether. As Abdullah put it 4 years after partition, in the Jammu and Kashmir Constituent Assembly, he said that this, quote, unnatural operation on an organic country had inflicted wounds that would not heal. For Jinnah, the realization of this Muslim state represented the achievement of subcontinental peace between otherwise irreconcilable equals. For his opponents, however, only a shared and properly reconciled India could have enjoyed that stature. Therefore, while Muslim separatism contended that only its own sovereignty could guarantee minority rights, I want to suggest that the Muslim secular fully embraced what I'm calling the historical loss of such sovereignty to enable a productive engagement with Indian democracy. So what do I really mean by this? In medieval and early modern Indian history, as many of you will know, sovereignty was significantly divided within and between empires. Even at the height of Mughal rule, this is true. But if pre-colonial power was often pluralized and shared in this manner, Muslims still exercised a significantly disproportionate amount of it and headed the most powerful political states of that period. And so my point is that by willfully foregoing this former dominance when thinking about modern forms of democratic power, our three anti-colonial thinkers, albeit differing degrees, struck a rare compact with the loss for a peaceful future. We've just seen that the Muslim secular possessed enough conceptual space to house some significant Muslim regional constituencies within it, this Indian democracy. These constituencies were not required to entirely relinquish their own claims to political power. And even if that's true, in the best interests of both the larger Muslim minority to which they belonged and to Indian society as a whole, they had to ultimately fold these claims into a new conception of shared Indian sovereignty. This compact with loss applied in an especially acute way to Azad's countrywide and nominal Muslim minority that was capable, he thought, of counterpoising a divided Hindu majority and whose Hindustani elite traced their lines back to the darbars of yesteryear. But it also named Muhammad Khan's politics too. His Pashtuns possessed a meta-commentary about their own autonomy on a distant frontier, which, though derived from pre-colonial sources, had been redoubled by colonial notions of a martial race. In Kashmir, which in colonial times was headed by a chauvinistic Hindu prince, who really experiments with ideas of a Hindu state, and that really is Mridu Rai's work on the Dogras. The earlier history of a local Muslim kingship there was particularly important to Sheikh Abdullah. But having said that, his idea of Kashmiri democracy never replaced one variety of sectarian sovereignty with another. So prior to 1947, our three protagonists accepted that an exclusive Muslim sovereignty was inapplicable to their collaborative present, for which all citizens and communities were of the same democratic value. As such, they calibrated their inheritances of Muslim political power accordingly. This was the mandatory right to be performed by Muslims for the preservation of India's social equanimity. But this right ought not to be mistaken as somehow sacrificial. For the strong were not meant to be foregoing something that they had attached great contemporary value to. Rather, they were actively stretching for what they now truly desired, the grander modern prize of democratic freedom and its attendant peace. That's certainly how it's framed. So in this way, Azad, Abdullah and Ghaffar Khan understood the structural truism with which I began this talk. While a majority must partake in creating the conditions for unity, only a willing minority could finally actuate it. So the active role of Muslims was particularly crucial for this political thought. This was not only because its creators belonged to Muslim groups or because of the particular nature of their histories or mythologies. Those things are important, of course. But most important was the fact that a democratic minority, by its very definition, had the unique ability to transcend itself. And if you think about the way the British colonial politics work, separate electorates and so on, it becomes increasingly obvious that that was true. So let me briefly summarize what I mean by this compacted loss before I move further. Because I think it's a particularly important but also complicated idea. This ethical historical sense or historicity that these men had precipitated both the full acceptance of lost Muslim sovereignty and in turn a productive democratic politics. It functioned as an apologetics to combat both Muslim minorityism and the threat of Hindu majoritarianism, which Gandhi and Nehru, however well-meaning, had much less reason to confront. The foundational embrace of loss, therefore, plays a considerable role in elevating the Muslim secular to a distinctive political theory. And the richness of that distinction should now, I hope, become apparent. Like Nehru, these three figures were not just concerned with coexistence, but they were also socialists who believed that the most fundamental political interests in India, or anywhere for that matter, were defined not by faith, but by changing socio-economic concerns. But because their secular nationalism was simultaneously concerned with retaining Islamic universalism, producing demographic solutions to the disempowering status of religio-political minority, and now grappling with a history of kingship or rulership, this was an unequivocally Muslim engagement. It is this duality which I wish to capture in my use of the Muslim secular to describe a distinct and rich secularity, one that is located within the grander intellectual tradition of secular Indian nationalism, and which I'm trying to pluralize and reconstruct in this book. And we can push this distinction even further with the fourth and final theme that I want to talk about, or concept that I'll try to unpack for you, that of parity, which Amir touched on, and I think the most crucial of all the key concepts that I'm dealing with. So, Nehru believed that Indian history was dominated by the ancient continuity of Hinduism. And therefore, despite writing the discovery of India, he chose not to give greatest weight to history when founding secular India. He instead reserved that privilege for two contemporary objectives, presentist objectives: a socialist politics of interest driven by the interventionist state, and a liberal democratic law that upheld the fundamental rights of all Indians. In these spheres, Nehru thought, there was apparently no threat of the Hindu appearing more Indian than Muslim. But Azad, Abdullah and Ghaffar Khan were unwilling to stop at this and wanted to concurrently establish secularism at the level of human interaction. Azad performed this task by resorting to the historical production of a profane national culture in the medieval and early modern periods. A member of the nobility or ashraf, whose Central Asian ancestors had arrived in North India during this phase of history, Azad claimed, in stark opposition to Nehru, that the culture of the contemporary nation was forged only once this final caravan of settlers reached Hindustan or North India. So for the Maulana and his coterie of Congress Muslim intellectuals around him, and the book really touches on figures like Humayun Kabir, Zakir Hussain, Sayyid Mahmood, figures like that. For these figures, the past was not just suitably common to Hindus and Muslims, but was the site of a joint achievement. And by focusing on the profane as opposed to the religious, this national culture had the power to further forestall the minoritization of Islam and its Indian inheritance. Irreducible to Hindu or Muslim, cultural elements like literature, art, and dress made for the shared inheritance of contemporary Indians. A historian of the present, Azad was interested more in inheritance than in history per se. He chooses, if you will, a culturalized Indian inheritance as opposed to a potentially exclusive Muslim legacy of monarchic power. The past, then, in many ways, is emptied of its politics. Concerned with both resisting national majoritarianism and preserving a minority religion, Azad's intention was to distinguish between what was shared by Hindus and Muslims, i.e. profane culture, and what was not, i.e. religion. That said, he and his acolytes were not overly anxious about drawing a precise boundary between these two different domains. Perhaps this was because they accepted the difficulty of doing so given the generally fluid character of human knowledge systems, and perhaps they understood their shared profane culture to have emerged out of two older cultural streams, and in want of better words, really, one you might describe as Indic or Sanskritic, and the other as Perso-Islamic, which made, of course, no such distinction between the profane and the religious. That, of course, is a modern concern of an inclusive nationalist. Right? So hence what mattered instead was an acknowledgement of the existence and integrity of these two separate domains, which were absolutely essential for the national project, even if there remained grey areas of overlap between them. And so religion and profane culture were therefore somewhat like, I think, two circles of a Venn diagram. And it's an interesting way or a useful way of understanding this area. So if Nehru was significantly different to Azad, that he privileged Indian identity over regional sub-identities also separated him from the Pashtun of Khan, and especially Abdullah, with whom he incidentally shared, of course, a Kashmiri heritage. The emphasis Nehru placed on central authority eventually brought him into conflict with Abdullah, who imagined a historical Indian unity which aggregated the analogous religious and ethno-linguistic autonomies of several provincial groups. And because Abdullah was determined to protect the distinctions of his Kashmiri subnation, he had to be satisfied with filling his grander Indian supranation with far less cultural content than either Nehru or Azad. In fact, though Abdullah also deployed other themes and concepts to serve his politics of scale, and these range, and I talk about them in the book, there's of course history, but there's also geography and topography, as well as socialism and monarchy. Abdullah nevertheless insisted on using history and geography especially to both distinguish Kashmiris and then paradoxically tie them back to India. There's this kind of, there's this conflict, which is, or if you like, which really animates his political thinking. So, to return to Gandhi, he, like our three Muslim thinkers, also conceived of secularism in principally social terms. Designed to govern everyday relations, secularism for the Mahatma amounted to a vernacular idea of tolerance and even love for the religious other, something which could terminate the toxic and ongoing cycle of betrayal fermented by the fraternal expectations that Hindus and Muslims had in each other. So to draw on Faisal Dinji's reading of Gandhi, prizing the difference that they found in their national partners and thus liberating themselves from their passive inherited brotherhood, Indians were made to instead actively befriend each other for a disinterested and less totalizing relationship. And I always think it's useful to break this concept down, or this idea down, by thinking of your own relationships with your siblings and the expectations that you attach to the promises that your siblings make to you, and the level of offense that is caused if those promises are not kept. Okay? And of course, Gandhi thinks that this is the problem with Hindus and Muslims. They have too many expectations of each other, and that leads to violence when those expectations are not fulfilled. And that really is what names communal riots and violence in the country. So it's better to befriend each other because you do a good deed to your friend. If your friend doesn't reciprocate, you can turn away without the same level of offense. And communal violence will take a very different turn That's his thing. So essentially, by abolishing the monopoly of familial loyalty in this way, Gandhi believed that he could put a stop to religious violence, or what was really fratricide. So Ghaffar Khan was closer to Gandhi in ethical terms than perhaps any other actor of the nationalist movement, and that's probably why the rather unfair label that is ascribed to him, that of the frontier Gandhi. But he also autonomously theorized the politics of active non-violence on the Pashtun frontier. This is very important, and I'm the first person to really make this claim. Because he prized Islamic commitments to forgiveness, patience, and restraint, as well as ideas of honor, freedom, and friendship found in Pashtunwali, the customary ethical code of the Pashtuns. As such, Ghaffar Khan persuasively argued that to willingly court colonial violence for the sake of reforming the oppressed and the oppressor alike, that was in fact something that was authentic to the ethical inheritance, both Islamic and Pashtun, of his people. So decolonizing his people in this way, at the All India level, Ghaffar Khan was interested in fashioning a reciprocal politics of obligation, for which one vowed to non-violently uphold the honor of one's compatriots. And you see him starting to depart from Gandhi a little bit. Though reflective of Pashtunwali, Ghaffar Khan refused to restrict this idea of moral reciprocity to the ethnic community alone, believing that it was comprehensible to everybody. And so he made it foundational to the national relationship between his Muslim Pashtuns, or Muslim Pashtun constituents on the one hand, and the Hindus of the Indian plains who predominated in Congress on the other. He thought that these were the two groups who were most committed to establishing an independent India. The small matter of their historical distrust, abetted of course by the colonial state, he believed to be suitably undone by his ethical pledges. In fact, his politics of pledges, however ethical, of course recreated the brotherly expectation that Gandhi observed. And that, of course, leads to statements like, you're being thrown to the wolves and so on. We've now established then that by locating their secular nations principally in the realm of social interaction, our three protagonists shared something with Gandhi that Nehru did not. But because Gandhi insisted on an absolute difference between Hindu and Muslim to actuate their new friendship, and so join Nehru in inadvertently deepening the latter's minorityhood, the Mahatma too eventually separates himself from what I'm calling the Muslim secular. For while Azad and Abdullah were adamant about the historical fusion of Hindu and Muslim portending to an Indian nationality, even the more presentist Ghaffar Khan focused so heavily on their common humanity in order to rise above, though never eradicate their difference. So it might already be apparent that, more than anything else, what separates these three Indian Muslim nationalists from both Gandhi and Nehru and binds them together is, in fact, the factor of parity. So what is this factor of parity? Intensifying, really, this refusal of minorityhood, these figures elevated their respective Muslim groups, whether Indian, Kashmiri, or Pashtun, and framed in that kind of way, to positions. They've elevated these Muslim groups to positions from which they could be equalized with the Hindu majority. Whether they focused on retelling history, Azad, pursuing interregional aggregation, Abdullah, or founding moral partnerships, Ghaffar Khan, collectively these men established a mode of thinking about Indian nationality that made the Muslim as crucial as the Hindu. Therefore, like its favorable demographic breakdown, the Muslim minority's disproportionate significance to a shared national life similarly forestalled any danger of its marginalization in a democracy. But parity as an idea has been associated not with social arguments for India's unity, but with Jinnah's demand that it be destroyed and be replaced by two constitutionally equal and sovereign nations. But insofar as they refused to be classified as an uninfluential minority and remained interested in an overt kind of equalization with Hindus as Muslims, Jinnah's Muslim opponents shared a language, however limited, with him, surpassing the liberal majoritarian understanding of equality as the plain abstract equivalence that exists between us as individual citizens. Both Jinnah and his opponents dealt squarely with what it meant to equalize Indians without undermining their religious collectivities or identities. Though they did not imagine a new separate society for their co-religionists, as Jinnah did, proponents of the Muslim secular used a not dissimilar idiom or language to affirm the culture of their existing shared one and preserve the influential place of their community within it. So without wishing to push the subjects of my book back into a narrative dominated by the Muslim League, it is still true, I think, to say that the broad spectrum of Muslim political thought in India nevertheless coheres around its challenge for the tendency of liberalism or liberal abstract equivalence to ignore and even assimilate difference. So, to be clear, our three thinkers imagined the jointly created Indian nationality which defined Hindus and Muslims not by their unequal numbers, but by their equal value. That's a very important distinction. But because Indians had been awarded this common rank or common value without deleting their individualities, they were not the same as, but were placed on a par with each other. They were alike in many respects, but they were not identical. Parity then is an especially useful concept for this national idea precisely because it inherently conveys this two-pronged notion, on the one hand commonality, and on the other distinction. Okay? So Jinnah was only ever interested in the second part of this equation. Right? He's only ever interested in the distinction there. So thus, producing a thicker definition of parity, the Muslim secular used this concept to positivize at once both the status of Hindus and Muslims as co-founders, as India's co-founders, and their religious authorities, right? So it can make both those claims at the same time. So parity is here a more exact category than equality per se, which requires another set of qualifications to avoid its blanket-like connotations. Equality as assimilation functions negatively by denying difference, whereas equality and parity is well positioned to positively assert claims to that difference. So unlike Jinnah, the Muslim secular doesn't contest the basic norms of democracy. That is to say, it is committed to the equal worth of every individual in a pre-given polity. And to think back to some of the pre-partition schemes that Jinnah suggests. I won't go into that in much detail, but you can guess what I'm thinking of. Nevertheless, even if the Muslim secular is committed to that equal worth of every individual, still, equality as parity is the conceptual force by which the Muslim secular pushes Indian democratic theory from within its own ambit to newer limits. Right? It's really extending the claims of what Indian democratic theory is. And in that way, I think a comparison with Ambedkar again is important. Because Ambedkar did something similar when he too resisted the majoritarian force of equivalence and assimilation to argue that differential rights for Dalits by way of affirmative action was the only way to secure liberty for all and in turn a legitimate form of Indian equality. To lean again a little bit on Kapila's work, by acknowledging that its citizens had never been a single people before, Ambedkar believed that modern law had the power to offset the historical and contemporary reality of discrimination by, in effect, establishing a contract between formerly unequal castes. Not dissimilarly, the Muslim secular makes Indian equality contingent on the total refusal of Muslim minoritization found in its full assertion of commonality and distinction. Conditional to a good life in the democratic epoch, then, this two-pronged parity was its retort to both its opponents and allies who in different ways, according to these figures, undervalued Muslims. If it admonishes its foes, Jinnah and Pakistan, but also, of course, the founder of Hindutva, Savarkar, it also lays down, I think, a challenge for its intellectual friends, namely Gandhi and Ali.
Thank you. It's really interesting because we hosted you at the Wednesday seminar at JNU 2 weeks ago, and you spoke predominantly as because we forced you to speak as This opens up different facets of the book, which I'm so glad it was brought up so well, so conceptually lucidly. Because you make this very crucial connection in the Muslim socialists, the loss of sovereignty, and that kind of flows into the idea of parity. So, on that note, which of the two should I ask you? That's excellent. Is that okay, Lawrence?
Yeah, sure. I'm very talkative, you just have to stop.
10 minutes, is that okay?
So I'm not going to go back to your main arguments because I think you've already summarized them brilliantly. I just want to say a few words about what I thought of the book and then make comments and questions.
Sure.
So I think your book makes a very strong case for the defense of intellectual history, which looks at Indian political actors as political thinkers and not just as political practitioners. And by focusing on very few actors, precisely you're able to delve into the complexity of their political thought, something which a more empirical history hardly ever does. And in the course of this exploration, you highlight not just the richness, but the creativity of these actors and the reach of their political thought, which is anything but prerogative. And I think that, we've already spoken about the universal dimension of their political thought, and I think that's a point that you made very forcefully. I think that is very important for us in several ways. One is it helps us recast these Muslim political actors, not just as minority actors. It really challenges this notion that Muslim political actors are primarily minority thinkers who are primarily relevant to Muslims, and it shows on the contrary that their political thought is relevant to the nation, if not even beyond, the nation. So this refusal of the minoritization of Indian Muslims, I think, is a very important part of this book. And here, if I can just very quickly make a point, I was thinking also of Kavita Dattla's work on Urdu as a secular language, and I thought that in some ways your argument here, resonates with hers. I also think that your study is very important to recast the relation between the region and the nation, or between the center and the periphery, in the sense that many studies on Indian Muslims tend to focus largely on North India, the Muslim heartland, as Kodesya would name it. I'm also guilty of that. And here you dedicate two very long chapters to two rather understudied in the sense their political focus, understudied Sheikh Abdullah and Dr Khan, who are rooted in regions that we usually think of as the periphery. And as a result of that location, we spontaneously tend to think of them as essentially regional actors. And here you make a very convincing case that their politics are relevant to the entire subcontinent. In fact, I think my favorite chapter is chapter 4, which is devoted to Dr. Khan, where you really basically argue that he recasts the northwest frontier as the heart of secular India. And I'm not going to go into the details of this argument, but I thought that was a very, you made a very convincing argument here. Now, I'm not going to go any further into your arguments. I just want to first raise two specific questions, then two more conceptual questions, and finally one methodological question. So first, so you've shown how these thinkers draw upon Islamic concepts. So for example, you evoke the notion of sabr, so fortitude, or in the case of Dr. Khan, in his interpretation of non-violence, you also speak of the greater and smaller jihad as a notion that he mobilizes, and the jihad is also a notion used by Abdullah. What is surprising to me is that you do not draw upon the notion of khidmat, service. You don't make it an object of analysis, even though, Dr. Khan named his movement Khudai, and I wonder why you did not do that, given the importance that you devote to other Islamic concepts, and that would also have allowed for fertile comparisons with Gandhi's notion of seva. So that's one. Another specific question. In your first chapters about Azad, you pit Azad against Hussain Ahmed Madani. And in a way, it's a good thing because it shows that we can't reduce these actors under a single tag of either nationalist Muslim or, the Maulanas, in a way that, Fatina Rani did recently. But I have a problem with what I see as a slightly reductive reading of Madani. In the sense that you tend to argue that Madani's conception of composite nationalism was quite narrow. You speak of religious particularism that is only interested in the preservation of Islamic practice in socialist India, and that forced Indian Muslims into a position of permanent minority. But I think that if you look at Barbara Metcalfe's work on Madani, it suggests a slightly more complex picture of Madani's thought that draws upon religious traditions as well as non-religious languages of anti-colonial struggle. Metcalfe shows how he for example, draws upon this whole language of economic subjugation basically, and he uses this fight against socioeconomic exploitation imposed by the British to build a common platform with non-Muslim nationalists. The other thing is he uses Islamic tradition also. He also draws upon Islamic universalism. He does not consider Islam to be the property of Muslims alone. In fact, he insists upon the universal appeal of Islam. And this idea, this classic Islamic idea that Islam is meant for everyone. So in that sense, and actually, Ambedkar suggests that this is one of the reasons why he opposes Pakistan with this idea that you cannot locate Islam in a single state. So actually, this Islamic universalism is one of the reasons why he opposes the formation of a Muslim nation state. And finally, in the post-colonial context, he advocated, much like Azad, joint electorates. He also insisted on this notion of serving nation as well as community, with this idea that by drawing upon their own Islamic values, Muslims should make themselves useful to the entire Indian nation. And so here I go back to this notion of service. I think here there's a way in which maybe Madni is not so parochial. That's one. Okay. I'll try to go into my larger questions fast. One of your among the key concepts that you use this idea of amity and enmity, and you make a really interesting point about how the shared legacy that Azad tries to put forward, as well as Abdullah and to a lesser extent, incorporated a history of both amity and enmity. So the idea is not to deny the battles of the past, the histories of oppression, but you need to recognize that, but to prioritize ties of amity. And in fact, this idea of building a shared polity is also to contain the destructive potential of enmity. But I wonder if the word enmity is the right word here. Because to me, amity versus enmity evokes, Carl Schmitt opposition between friend and foe, where the enemy cannot be accommodated. And here there's a risk of, essentializing ties of friendship and enmity. Whereas to me, the word rivalry or adversary would have been more suited, because the difference with enmity is that the word rivalry leaves open the possibility for reconciliation to a much greater extent than enmity. And it seems to me that actually much of their efforts was precisely to make sure that the rivalries of the past would not turn into permanent enmity. And that's what separated them from, let's say, Savarkar, who considered Hindus and Muslims as permanent enemies. And so here I was thinking, thinking of that, I was thinking of Chantal Mouffe's work on democracy, where she makes this distinction between political adversaries and political enemies. And her point is to say that democracy is based not on consensus, but on building a common platform that keeps the confrontation open by giving voice to adversaries. So it's the idea of building a platform that allows political adversaries to have different opinions, but not to let them become enemies. So I think here maybe that's a question I have for you. Why enemy rather than adversary or rival? Another point. One of the common aspects of these thinkers is their keenness to create a shared polity, but also to preserve the religious autonomy of Muslims, and that's something you come up to quite often. But I wonder if sometimes you do not create the impression that that the religious sphere is granted, is a given, that can be preserved as autonomous. We need to ask ourselves, what conception of religion is this very notion of religious autonomy premised upon? Because there is no such thing as a religious sphere that exists by itself. In fact, this idea, for example, that there is such a thing as a religious sphere that is separated from either culture or politics or the economy is a very modern construct that goes back to the colonial period and that is constantly, being debated. And so I wonder if, maybe it would not have been worth asking more forcefully the question of what is the conception of a religion that they use to then argue for religious autonomy? And is there a potential tension between the universal appeal of Islam that they often invoke and the desire to preserve that religious autonomy? Or is there a tension between Islam as quote-unquote only religion and this idea that Islam is also religious, is also something that has to do with culture? For example, in the post-colonial context, religion and culture are often clubbed together as something that is that exists independently of politics. But in your book, you argue that Azad, tried to defend the idea that there was such a thing as a shared culture, even as he wanted to retain religious autonomy for Muslims. So, yeah, basically, I wonder if you can go back to the very conception of religion that is that is the foundation of their understanding of religious autonomy. Finally, and I'll stop there, a more methodological question. This is a wonderful and nuanced interpretation of these actors' political. But sometimes it feels to me that you're a little too keen to show the coherence in the thought of these actors. Maybe because you want to show that they are proper political thinkers. But as a result, I have a feeling that sometimes that you tend to push aside potential contradictions, or actually, because it's a very nuanced study, so you do go into the different aspects of their thought, but even if there are things that may appear as contradictions, you're very eager to show that actually they are not contradictions, they form part of a coherent thought. And I wonder if it would not have been sometimes more productive to highlight inner tensions and contradictions, even sometimes possible self-betrayals of one's own thought. Because after all, it would not be surprising that these actors would contradict themselves throughout the course of their career. After all, they did not live in an isolated ivory tower. They were political thinkers and practitioners. They were confronted to many different challenges in a fast-evolving context, and so it would completely be understandable that they would, in the course of their career, contradict themselves. And so maybe that's one. I don't come from an intellectual history background, and so why I understand that it's very important to restitute the richness and complexity of political thought. I think that sometimes this form of history can be too disconnected for my own taste from the pragmatic aspects of political life that may help us explain some of these contradictions. And here, there's one French author I was thinking of, Pierre Rosanvallon, who developed who pushed for conceptual political history, where he insists on the need to explore what he calls the structural antinomies of political context. And I wonder if it cannot be quite productive to pinpoint the actual contradictions of these actors, which does not diminish in any way their importance as critical thinkers. That's the case that you have very forcefully made. So, question on that. Yeah, and then we'll just stop here.
Yeah, another long list. No, but I'll take it.
That's fine.
You read this yourself, so no, but it's of course it goes without saying that it's a thought-provoking work. I must confess, so my comments, concerns essentially arise from the introduction in the first chapter, and of course the presentation. So I haven't read the book from start to finish. I'll start on a lighter note. I've been very curious about the prefix Maulana absolutely, and this is a question that was raised many years ago in an international seminar. It was actually a 3-day international seminar on Maulana, and this was a question that was asked to the stalwarts, people like David Lederer, Michel Besson, and Javed Iqbal and the rest, but for some strange reason it was ducked. Why this Maulana? Because as far as the conventional understanding goes, there's a certain credential that needs to be placed. But of course, this is not really a query that needs to get into. But I've been curious about this for a while.
You share with the Pandit with me.
Yeah.
One of the Pandit's good friends.
Okay, so now moving on. Now I want to draw your attention to another Maulana, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Now, of course, you refer to Muhammad Ali Jinnah in the introduction and passing, and I've been quite perturbed by a certain negligence vis-a-vis Muhammad Ali Jinnah, because in my modest opinion, I haven't read all of his works, but whatever little I've read, I think there's some very extraordinary stuff to say about secularism, nationalism, communal representation, community rights, etc. So I was just thinking about whether, because I believe the broader argument that you're making, if we, of course, every book project, every PhD thesis has a certain scope, a certain ground to cover, but I'm just thinking about Muhammad Ali Jinnah because, in a way, he questions the very premise of secularism, of the sort that Congress was essentially projecting post-Gaddafi. So some of his writers, and I'm particularly drawing from communal representation, which is an extraordinary reflection. It puzzles me to no end that why no historian has really looked. Of course, I wouldn't really make this claim that I've read everything that historians of modern South Asia have written, but to my knowledge, he's somebody who's not really looked at. So there is, in Muhammad Ali Jinnah, we get to see a certain unholy alliance between secularism and nationalism. And that kind of problematizes a range of discourses that are otherwise quite acceptable in mainstream scholarship on modern South Asia. So that is, because one of his arguments, just passingly, is that whenever there is a certain claim that is made in the interest of the Hindu community, it becomes a secular national claim. And the moment there's a claim made in relation to the Muslim community, it becomes a communal claim. Now, this is 1925, it's very early, and this is ridiculously perceptive and far-sighted. Because I think these are some of the questions that now some of the political scientists and social scientists are grappling with. Moving on, something that you keep going back to, this parallel between caste and minority. Of course, there is a certain intellectual incentive in this parallel. But then I would also want to make a case for what we could perhaps call a certain plurality vis-a-vis subaltern political consciousness, subaltern counter-politics. So while one can definitely make this argument that what Dr. Ambedkar was arguing in relation to upliftment of the marginalized, the historically, socially marginalized communities could also be extended in relation to this Muslim secular political pitch. But at the same time, I think Ambedkar is also very clear that if at all an associated mode of living is to be conceptualized and more importantly experienced in post-colonial India, in independent India, it would not be perhaps possible without annihilating caste. Right. Now, can we really then think about annihilating religion or a certain kind of, even a certain kind of religious consciousness in terms of facilitating a certain inter-community, inter-group living? So in that sense, I'm just thinking that whether one can really push that as much as one senses in your book, this panel, and it is not simply a case of intra and inter. This is, I think, more complicated than that. So this, the other thing, and this is not particularly from history or sociology, but more from sociology of professions, sociology of medicine, when we talk about interaction, and because you speak about interactive nationalism, it's an interesting concept. But again, as a sociology student, I'm compelled to think about interaction itself as a term, which is always determined by a certain power equation. So there is, and particularly so when we speak about social interaction, because social interaction is never devoid of power equations. Every interaction has its own grammar, and there's a way in which the two parties, or even more, they enter into that interactive landscape. So, at least my training tells me that interaction is not really a domain that is free of power relations. There are always concessions that are offered by one particular party, and these are then capitalized by another party. So I just wanted to, so this interactive nationalism, and once again I go back to Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Ambedkar, who essentially, of course not directly, but I think in some ways when we are looking at the interaction between Hindu-Muslim, in the case of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and the interaction between Dalit and non-Dalit, in the case of Ambedkar, they're very clear that the very turf is not really in favor of the marginalized. It is not really in favor of those who are powerless. The other, and I'm towards the end, in relation to this very, of course, it's a fantastic thing to speak about equalizing. But I'm also, and I'm essentially borrowing from the broader discourse of empowerment. That whenever we speak about empowerment, implicit in that aspiration is the idea that there is again non-parity. There are power differentials, right? So you cannot empower without disempowering. In that sense, how are we making a case for equality? Because this is one side of the narrative, right? So then, when our protagonists are speaking about equalizing, of course, it's very exciting and fascinating to be an audience too. But then it is also about the premise is that there is no equality, and therefore we have to equalize. Now, what are the contours of that landscape which is characterized by a certain absence of equality? And because in your chapter on Azad, and this is something you touched upon in the introduction as well, that Azad sort of, he's not really as much invested in medieval history because it's a very selective, it's a very intelligent, in that sense, reading of history because he has a certain project that he has to attend to. But I'm also, I'm absolutely certain that Azad majorly capitalized history in so many of his writing, particularly his literary writing, his journalistic pieces wherein he borrowed from Persian, classical Persian Arabic literature. And his famous Dijans address, where there's a repeated reference to the mosque and the background, and his annual contribution, if I'm not mistaken, 1949 address, where he's repeatedly telling the Aligarh student. Of course, the audience is, there's something absolutely self-explanatory, again, being the site of a certain political sentiment. And just one before we end, because what the title, it's of course it's a fantastic title, but I'm also thinking about another Muslim secular, which is again to do with the ulama, which is a very different spectrum of Muslim seculars. I'm thinking about someone like Kitabullah, who through very elementary textbooks these are scholars, of course, ulama, but they're trying to sort of bring about a certain understanding of other cultures, revered figures of other religions, etc. And even Hussain al-Mani, of course, that's a longer conversation. And because we were talking about the title, I think something equally fascinating is Shaykh Karim's recent Intimacy, quite a remarkable title. And once again, looking at the relations after the empire. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Somebody want to solve that problem?
Yeah, I'll do my best. It's a wonderful set of comments. I'm very, very grateful to both of you, Laurence and Irfan, for that. Yeah, I don't know where to begin actually. Where to begin? Maybe if we go in reverse, things are fresh. Yeah, I would just say on this question of equalizing, I think it's very interesting the way you framed it actually. That while equalizing means the empowering of one, therefore the disempowering of another. I think that's quite interesting. What about something different? What about there is I think for many of these figures I'm necessarily agreeing with them. For them, like, there is an organic equality which democracy threatens to take away. Which is a very different, it's quite interesting to think of democracy and the arrival of democracy and the arrival of political representation as being this thing which is going to equalize us as citizens. And it's going to be this great liberating moment. But actually it's the reverse. Perhaps it's the reverse. Perhaps it's actually to produce a politics of majoritarianism by default. And it's Iqbal's concern, of course, with the nation and the national moment. So I don't know. I don't think they think. I don't think they think of this, empowering or elevate. I haven't used the word empowering. I use the word elevating, right? And I don't know if these figures would think of it as in this totalizing, sociological way. Dare I say, of empowering and then disempowering the majority as a result. Because of course, the concern here is actually with the abstract category of value rather than the number. And so if there is any disempowering that's going on, it's happening at that level. So I don't know, I mean, I'll have to think more about it, but those are some initial thoughts. You spoke also about interaction being something which is inevitably about power, and that's very interesting because and the need for concession in a plural political setting. There is concession going on here, of course, because what is being demanded is a twofold concession. One, that Muslims make the concession in the aftermath of historical power, and Hindus make the concession it's in the event of or the imminent arrival of democratic power or demographic power. And they have to do this in various ways. And Laurence spoke about the importance of region and center in the world. I mean, that is part of that conception. I think, I just back a little bit on the caste parity thing. My point is not to say that these guys are producing something entirely the same as Ambedkar. It was just, if anything, it's a very limited comparison I'm making. And in brief, it is there in the book in chapters 2 at various points. But all I'm trying to say is that this is an engagement with how to think about the arrival of democracy and what it means for equality or the lack of. And so I don't think it's really necessarily about annihilating religion or anything like that at all. And of course, Ambedkar's project is about social justice, which these figures are not interested in the same way. Or they think that social justice can be created through economics, right? And through socialist politics, whether Nehruvian or in Abdullah's case, something like that. I would just maybe warn against that a little bit. And it's interesting because a lot of people have asked me, especially younger Muslim students in universities, they'll ask, well, how do we apply some of this stuff? And I was like, well, I'm just an English historian, please kind of uncover the political theory. But I think the lack of social justice or engagement with political social justice coming from an upper caste positionality is interesting, and I touch on it in the conclusion and talk about the limitations of these political ideas. And it's, I think, one of the reasons why Ambedkar actually appeals to Muslim politics. So that's what I would say about that. On Muhammad Ali, it's very interesting that his kind of criticism of the secular and nationalist sounds almost like Iqbal, a figure who I'm much more familiar with. I mean, I have looked at Muhammad Ali's and he briefly appears in the book as well. But I would just say that the only kind of excuse I can give is to say that I had to kind of, and I'll deal with what Laurence very interestingly put as like the kind of contradictions or the need for coherence. And I wouldn't shy away from the fact that I wanted to produce a coherent book. And in doing so, I also wanted to focus on a particular moment in India's history, where the debate about the nation is squarely on the table, after the collapse of the relations and so on. So that is kind of what I would say. I think to turn to you also made the point about the ulema, and Laurence also hinted at it, and it's absolutely true. And I think a little bit, I do touch on Barbara's work, Barbara McCullough's work on meticulous, which she's written quite a lot on it. And it's interesting, I'm glad you brought up the stuff about the anti-colonial struggle, economic subjugation and so on. But I think where he departs from Azad is that there isn't this long engagement with a shared history in the realm of culture, right? And that bifurcation, that kind of, dare I say, false bifurcation between religion and culture, which is, a concern of nationalist thinking. When he talks about history, quite interestingly, he's talking about India's Muslim history, right? And he talks about Adam's Peak in Sri Lanka, and really, Islam. He almost makes this he makes this argument not for parity, but in fact for Islam's preeminence in India, because actually, India is the second home of Islam because of Adam's Peak in Sri Lanka, or his present in Sri Lanka, and then you'll make an argument about the burial, right? That actually Muslims are buried in the earth. Hindus are reincarnated, so the real Indians are in fact Muslims because they're buried in this earth, right? So it's a very different tenor. That the historical narrative is quite different to Azad's. And of course, he makes the argument which Azad does too about the Islamic universal and breaking countries down into racial entities, and that's one of the reasons why Pakistan has to be opposed and all of that. And there are these joint electorates and there's service for the nation as a whole, but that interaction that I was so interested in bringing out, which for Azad was cultural, was something I felt that he didn't share. And even if he is a richer political thinker than perhaps I've given, I have maybe not given him his due, and that's fair enough. But I would also say that his emphasis of the theological means that he then departs somewhat from these figures. And so this, it's very interesting what you said about amity and enmity. And it's interesting, I think I don't really bring Schmitt into the book. I think at one point I do, right?
Yes,
in relation to maybe nationalism, I think.
Yes, you speak of Savarkar's notion of permanent enemies in France, and you bring in culture.
And so what I wanted to kind of do with these Indian political thinkers was to allow enmity to have its own definition, if you like. Now maybe we could argue about the language that's used, whether we should use animosity, whether antagonism, use rivalry. I don't know if enmity is something that is permanent. That's interesting. Is enmity something which can only be permanent, or can enmity exist alongside amity? That is something that I need to think a little more about, perhaps. But I really wanted to emphasize that rather than Indian political thought being some kind of derivative discourse, that actually these concepts take on their own meaning. One of the criticisms, of course, of Indian political thinking, Indian democratic political thinking, and especially by use of the word secular, has been, is this in fact something that you're imposing? Well, of course not, right? These are concepts which are being reanimated. So maybe we can have a more detailed discussion about this, but I would just be, my only kind of response would be to allow enmity to take its own course, but maybe we could use antagonism instead.
But what are the terms that they use themselves in this? Because I think, for example, secularism is undoubtedly a concept that is used by, actors here. It is a vernacular concept in that sense. But what about amity and enmity? What are the terms that are used by the actors themselves?
Yeah, so like that's a very good point, because what's actually coming out is that they're not using the term necessarily, it's coming out in the statements, right? So as you collect the statements together, what are you going to call this thing? What are you going to call, Azad, famously says at Ramgarh in 1940, his address to Congress, like, whether we like it or not, we're a nation. We've lived in this place for so long. Yes, we've had our battles with each other, but yes, look, we share all these things. So in fact, the battles that we've had with each other name our nationality too. That is what actually produces our commonality. So it was in those things that I then tried to find, or language to describe what was going on and do this kind of textual, very close, what I thought was very close to textual analysis. You spoke about autonomy and the religious sphere, and this tension between, I think it's a really beautiful way of putting it, this tension between universal, on the one hand you're claiming the universal, and on the other hand you're guarding the religious community. What does that say about the limits of this universalism? And it made me think of Gandhi actually, when he speaks about the winds, and I want to open the windows of my home so that winds from the directions coming, but I don't want to stop that. And in a sense, there are limits to this universality. I talk about it in relation to Humayun Kabir, especially I think in one of the chapters, the first chapter and the second chapter, about the limits that is placed on universality. And of course, these are artificial things. There's a definite tension there. But then, I did want to produce something coherent, and I tried to say, I think the problem is that history writing has been, Indian history writing, South Asian history writing, has been so oriented around context and interest that ideas get left out. It's quite funny because political theorists turn around and say, well, this is a contextually very, rich text, and and then actually, it's evidence-based. And then my own fraternity say to me, well, what about the context? So it's like, well, where to go? I would actually, my main interest here was actually to produce an abstract set of ideas, and I tried to be loyal, faithful to the context as much as I could be in doing so. So every shift, especially with Abdullah, he's the most, in want of a better word, shifty political actor of the lot. But I tried to mark each and every shift. And I don't believe that political maneuvers are somehow a betrayal of one's principles and ideas. I think that principles and ideas get moved around or are made to adjust to context, of course, and respond to context. But I do believe that political positions that are taken, political responses to context, do come from an ideological basis. I've of course been schooled in that way as well. So that is something I would certainly defend, if I may.
Maybe if I could just, there's an ideological infrastructure in that sense, There is this sense that ideology is not the superstructure but the infrastructure.
Absolutely, and you see that with, people say, well, how can Abdullah be a coherent political thinker? He's prior to independence, when, at the great moment of theorizing, right, and anti-colonial India is the space in which the future is imminent. One can think about what that future is going to look like, and we can think about it in these different ways, in these competing ways. And it's this kind of, dare I say, kind of pure intellectual realm. Suddenly you're thrown into this post-colonial phase, and everyone's political positions are competing with each other for power, right? And so in that earlier, more organic phase, he's producing this very rich political theory, organic political theory, or scalar political theory of India as federal. Right? He's thrown into the context of partition and independence, and suddenly there's this kind of pluralizing of India. He uses this hilarious kind of analogy of kind of socialistic analogy, in fact, of the Kashmiri bride who now has two suitors instead of one. Right? So this was an easy romantic relationship between India and Kashmir. Now suddenly you have two suitors. What happened there? How did one person become two people? It's kind of hilarious on one level, but that is precisely the point. That actually the context has changed. His ideas now need to change. So should Kashmir be independent? Should it go to Pakistan? Should it go to India? And that whole debate is still grounded in that original theory. Right? It's just a response. So he can be an Indian nationalist, someone who's considering Kashmiri independence, and not necessarily being ideologically disloyal to himself. And I try to map that because he's of course a figure who people want to dismiss as intellectually inconsistent. I don't think that's true. What else did we had so many good things to say. Oh yeah, about service. I think that was a beautiful point, as and the importance of it, and khidmat and seva. I don't know actually. Is the answer why I didn't pick up on that. Why I didn't focus on it. Maybe because I felt that Muhammad Ali Jinnah had already done it. Maybe and that khidmat is, of course, the way she maps it as regional. right? And it's a khidmat to the end of tribal, fratricide in her rendering, and I agree with that. You could, I have this idea in the book of the gatekeeper, and the Pashtun gatekeeper, who is going to guard the subcontinent from invasion, whether physical or ideological. And in ways kind of mimics Iqbal in some ways as well, he makes a similar kind of thing. But the idea of the gatekeeper in Farooqi's rendering, he's saying that, well, this is actually a colonial idea. We are told that we are the gatekeepers, so we can't have rights. Right? This is a colonial borderland, so you can't actually have representative rights. In the same way that the rest of India is slowly being given this quasi-democracy. You can't have that. Turn that on its head and be the gatekeeper of the Pashtuns are now your gatekeepers. Right? And so the offer, that pledge is being made. Now you claim that we should have the same rights as you. Right? And that's how we're going to produce this Indian nation. Now, you could very well say that's khidmat. Right? So you could theorize khidmat through that. For instance, I'm just trying to think of it a little bit. That was what I kind of thought of when you said that. I think I kind of...
That was the first point you made, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's also because, I work on Zakir Hussain, and I think service is central to his the way in which he precisely resolves, that tension between finding parity, as you said, accommodating both commonality and a difference. I think he resolves that tension through the notion of service. So that's why, this was also something that's a question.
No, that's a great point.
Right, so let me open the floor to other questions and other questions.
I had a question.
Yeah.
So it was relating
You want to introduce yourself?
so I'm Calistine Lewis. I'm an intern at here under the Gender Initiative. I'm studying conflict and peace studies in Jamia currently. So my question was about your ideas of loyalty and nationalism, the nation state and sub-nationalism. And there was this article that can a Muslim be an Indian? And in that, where they talk about, it's always the words Indian and nationalist is always Indian Christian, Indian Muslim, but never Indian Hindu. Or nationalist, if you're Muslim, you're a Muslim nationalist, as a Hindu person is automatically assumed to be a nationalist. But relating this idea, however, my question is what you said is that you tend to focus not just on North Indian, but I wanted to know if you looked at also South Indian Muslim history in that sense, in the history of India, because Islam entered through the south, through merchants in Kerala before it entered through the north. So when you talk about Muslim-dominated sub-nationalisms and geography and the Deccan Plateau, when you look at regions like Malabar, regions like Deccan where the Nizam was there, do you think that, and then relating this to partition and geography, that once partition happened, the loyalties in North India shifted. Your alliances, whether you could have moved there, you didn't, so now you are, where does your loyalty lie? Most of that happened in the north, where people like Vallabhbhai Patel, a lot of people within the Congress constantly used to refer to Muslim politicians, or people engaged being, suspicious that whether they were going to switch loyalties. However, this does not happen, or did not happen as much in South, at least. And do you think then, connecting it to the present now, that with the subjugation or silencing, or you see that there is a shift in the narrative of Muslim voices, because even now the national spokesperson of Muslim communities of secularism comes from Hyderabad, like AIM and things like that, or the defenders of parties that are not aligned with Hindu nationalism are often those concentrated in the south, because what you talk about composite nationalism has been able to develop in a region that was not as much touched by partition as the rest of the country. So do you think that sort of nationalism, what you say about finding that convergence, that composite culture has shifted to the south because we've not been affected by the same thing that historically the North India has had historically.
So we take a question, or should we
Totally up to you.
let's get some more questions? Okay. Someone else who wants to take a question?
Yeah, no, that's a really great set of reflections. It's interesting because in the conclusion of the book, I kind of say, well, what are the legacies for India from the politics of Apartheid, for instance? That's of course Pakistan's legacy. That's an interesting legacy in and of itself. Reimagining Pakistan as a pluralistic place. But I think that one of the interesting legacies out of this kind of idea that you regionalize Islam in order to solve the problem of Hindu-Muslim politics at a central level, the legacy of that actually resides in places like West Bengal, Assam, and Kerala, where Muslims are between 25 and 35% of the population. They're not majorities there. They're not majorities in the way that they were in the frontier and Kashmir in this period and remain so in those places today. But what regional nationalism or sub-nationalism enables is the undercutting of, dare I say, strident political manifestations or unitary political identities or uncompromising political identities from the center. Right? And I think that is true still of those places I just listed out, and what I've also been hinting at, because there Muslims are mobilizing around regional identities alongside other religious groupings, right? Allows them to undercut religious nationalism, for instance. Right? So it's a really good point that you made. The book is very much North Indian focused, I must admit, and I wanted to kind of, insert these figures into Indian political thought canon, to be very honest. But I also wanted to kind of show the difference in two very important contexts. One being a national minority context, in which Azad, I thought, was the most important or obvious political actor to look at. And then another context which I thought, and Laurence very kindly mentioned it, has kind of been forgotten, which is that there's a context in which Muslims are a majority. When we think about majorities in colonial India, we think about Bengal, or we think about Punjab, but they're not Muslim majority provinces at all. If we look at the work of some of the great historians of the Cambridge School, for instance, Aisha Jalal, Joya Chatterjee, and so on, they'll often talk about those places as majority Muslim majority provinces, but they're actually pluralities, right? They're only marginally Muslim, 55%, and you have ascendant Hindu and Sikh minorities in Punjab, for instance. Same is true for the minority in Bengal. So actually, these are the Muslim majority lands, right? Of course, there are others, there's Sikh as well, stuff. But these are actually places in which it makes some sense. There's some logical sense as to why Indian nationalist alternatives emerge in those places. That's not to say that alternatives can't emerge in Punjab and Bengal. We have that because, like, first of all, the Unionists, for instance, they're not necessarily nationalists in the same way, right? But so what I'm trying to say is that this kind of this new lens of regional allows us to shift the debate around Muslim political thought and Muslim politics more generally away from the heartland. And that is to say that I hope that I've opened up a conversation about that, which then can be taken into other places, like especially the East and South.
On that note, if I can make a comment, I think like the significance, of course, there's a critique that is going on, but I think one of the significance of this work is actually to make some of the political thinkers, if you like, which are also political practitioners at the same time, accessible. Because in terms of intellectual history and then therefore conceptual history, once this is available, I think some kind of engagement becomes possible. So there's land is fertile with further investigation. So if accessibility is something that is really fascinating, I think great work.
Oh, I hope so. Thank you.